Oh, and Marcus Ray had never imagined he would leave the open road for a place like this, a master-planned community with matching mailboxes, enforced lawn heights, and well-meaning neighbors who waved with rehearsed smiles but never actually asked your name. After 35 years running his own chain of auto repair shops across Texas, Marcus had earned the right to retire where the sidewalks were clean and silence reigned after 9 p.m. When he bought the 2-story brick home on Cotton Hill Lane, nestled in what the developer proudly called an elevated lifestyle environment, he wasn't looking for community events or barbecue nights. He just wanted peace and predictability after a life that had been anything but. He had worked hard, played by the rules, and buried 2 dogs and a wife. Now he wanted a clean driveway, strong coffee in the mornings, and a house that didn't leak when it rained. The house itself was everything he'd wanted. Newer build, single owner before him, located on a quiet cul-de-sac with a covered porch where he could drink coffee and ignore the world. He didn't need much else, but it was that porch, ironically, that would become the first battlefield. Within days of moving in, Marcus noticed the entry light over the door was barely functional. It flickered constantly and sometimes failed altogether. The narrow street outside was dim at night, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and made your shadow feel like an intruder. A few weeks earlier, during a late-night grocery run, his sister-in-law, who had helped him move, slipped coming up the steps, tripped on the top stair when the light didn't turn on, and landed hard enough to bruise her ribs. That was enough for Marcus. He didn't waste time arguing with warranties or maintenance requests. He ordered an industrial-grade motion-activated LED floodlight, energy-efficient but bright enough to slice through fog. He installed it himself the same afternoon it arrived. No one said a word. That night he sat on the porch, beer in hand, and watched it click on as a raccoon crossed the lawn. The light flared, illuminating the entire entryway and part of the street, before fading back into darkness 30 seconds later. Efficient. Practical, harmless, or so he thought. The first letter came in a white envelope slid beneath his door. Not mailed, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a printed violation notice, complete with an official-looking logo, poorly aligned margins, and language that tried too hard to sound professional. Your exterior light fixture has been deemed non-compliant with the community's visual harmony standards, it read, citing Section 4.7 of some architectural guideline he'd never seen. A penalty of $400 has been added to your property ledger. Please correct this violation within 10 days to avoid further escalation. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, confused more than angry. He had no idea what a property ledger was. No one had spoken to him. No warning, no knock on the door, no phone call. Just this strange document, cold and impersonal, like being fined by a vending machine. He tossed the letter on the kitchen counter and forgot about it until 3 days later, when a woman named Karen Nolan appeared on his porch wearing a tailored beige blazer and the kind of smile that made Marcus instinctively reach for his wallet. She didn't introduce herself with a handshake, just announced that she was the neighborhood liaison for compliance matters, and that she was here to offer him friendly guidance before his situation escalated to formal review. Marcus asked if she meant the porch light. She nodded without making eye contact and began explaining, clearly for the 50th time, how the community valued subtle, low-warmth lighting and a cohesive nighttime aesthetic. She used the word cohesive 3 times. Marcus said he wasn't interested in nighttime aesthetics. He was interested in not tripping down the stairs or fumbling for keys in the dark. She responded with a plastic laugh and something about neighborly expectations. It was clear that this wasn't a discussion. It was a warning. He could have argued. He could have cited safety codes or asked why the original light fixture was so dim in the first place. Instead, he asked her if there had been any official meeting about this, or if someone had simply decided they didn't like the way his porch looked. Karen's smile thinned like a paper cut. "We try not to bother the board with first-time infractions," she said, "but continued resistance tends to suggest hostility toward the neighborhood values we've all agreed to." Marcus blinked. He'd never agreed to anything beyond the purchase price and closing papers. He didn't attend welcome mixers or read monthly bulletins. If there had been neighborhood values, no one had delivered them to his door until now. After she left, Marcus sat at the kitchen table for a long time. It wasn't about the light. It was never just the light. Something about her tone, the way she lingered near the edge of his porch like she was assessing property lines, stuck in his ribs like bad chili. He looked at the notice again. Still no name on it. Just resident. He thought about ignoring it altogether. But then the electrician showed up. The man was polite but confused. Said he had been called out by the office to evaluate and remove a non-compliant fixture at Marcus's address. Said it was already paid for. Marcus told him firmly but calmly that he wasn't going to be touching anything on this property. Not without a court order. The guy apologized and left. Later that night, Marcus replaced the light with a smarter version, programmable, with 3 brightness settings. But the next morning, it was gone. Removed. Cleanly. No broken wires, no mess. Just the screws left dangling. And a second violation notice. This time, the penalty had doubled. Now it was $800. The envelope was tucked under his windshield wiper like a parking ticket. That's when something in Marcus turned. Not rage, not fear. Something colder, older. The deep instinct to push back when someone pisses on your front step and calls it rain. He wasn't going to be chased from his own porch by paperwork and polite threats. He wasn't going to dim his world just because someone in a beige blazer thought the shadows looked prettier that way. So he made a decision. If they had a problem with one light, they were going to hate 12. He didn't act out of anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. He measured every beam of his roofline. He studied the angles, the blind spots, the zones most vulnerable to tampering. He ordered commercial-grade floodlights typically used for parking lots, each with motion sensors, waterproof casings, and app-controlled timers. Installation took 2 days. He mounted 6 lights facing outward from the house and 6 more around the perimeter of his fence. When the system went live, the property transformed at night into something between a prison yard and a sports arena. The sky lit up. Shadows fled. The entire street glowed with an artificial white radiance that no one could ignore. And just like that, the war had begun. But Marcus wasn't just defending his porch anymore. He was drawing a line in the light. The first night the lights were activated, Marcus didn't sleep. Not because he was anxious. On the contrary, there was something deeply satisfying about watching the full perimeter of his home glow with undeniable, unapologetic intensity. From the upstairs window, it looked as though a minor sun had risen around the property. Motion sensors responded with precision. Every squirrel, every falling leaf, every late-night walker triggered a gentle flare of brilliance, then faded out without fanfare. The effect was dramatic but controlled. Marcus had adjusted the timers, the brightness levels, even the angles so the lights didn't shine directly into any neighboring windows. Unless, of course, someone was standing too close to the fence. He made sure of that. It wasn't meant to be provocative. It was meant to be decisive. By the second night, he noticed changes. Curtains that had once remained open were now firmly drawn. Driveways that had been casually occupied during late-night smoke breaks were suddenly empty. And then came the visitor. Just past 11 p.m., a vehicle pulled up and parked across the street, its engine running for several minutes before the lights cut off. The silhouette in the driver's seat never moved. Marcus didn't panic. He watched. Eventually, the car drove off, slowly, without headlights. He made a mental note of the license plate. Not because he felt threatened, but because he knew enough to start keeping records. The next morning, a folded piece of paper was tucked under the doormat. No envelope this time. No logo, no header, just 3 sentences, handwritten in block capitals. You are disturbing the peace. Remove all installed floodlights within 48 hours. Consider this your final courtesy. Marcus turned the note over. Blank. He didn't need a signature. He knew where it came from. The tone was different now. Less official, more desperate. He left the note on the counter and went outside to check the lights. Everything intact, no signs of tampering. Still, he adjusted a few camera angles and added a solar-powered spotlight to cover the blind spot by the side gate. Later that day, as Marcus was cleaning his garage, a white SUV rolled slowly past, then reversed and stopped just short of his driveway. The window lowered, revealing Karen Nolan once again, this time without the blazer or the clipboard. She wore sunglasses, though it was cloudy, and her tone had sharpened significantly since their last exchange. "I assume you received the letter," she said, voice flat. "I've received a few things," Marcus replied calmly. "Hard to tell who's sending what." "You're making a lot of people uncomfortable," she said. "There have been complaints." "About lights?" he asked. "Or about the fact that I didn't cave?" Karen's lips pressed into a straight line. "You're not making friends, Marcus." "I didn't move here to make friends," he said, stepping forward, wiping his hands on a rag. "I moved here to be left the hell alone. But that doesn't seem to be an option." "There are procedures in place," she continued, ignoring the provocation. "You're undermining the integrity of the neighborhood." Marcus tilted his head. "You mean I'm not playing along?" She said nothing to that, just rolled the window up and drove off, leaving behind the scent of forced civility and something colder beneath it. That night, the lights stayed on a little longer. The timers were reset manually. Every corner of the property glowed with an intensity that made shadows irrelevant. The escalation didn't take long. 2 mornings later, Marcus woke to find a yellow notice duct-taped to his garage door. Unauthorized use of non-approved exterior lighting fixtures. Secondary violation issued. Additional fine. $1,200. The paper was wrinkled, the tape torn as if it had been applied in a rush. He took it down without ceremony and placed it in a drawer with the others. He wasn't going to waste ink or breath arguing with the ghostwriters of anonymous rulebooks. But that afternoon, as he sat drinking coffee on the porch, a patrol car rolled down the street and stopped in front of his house. The officer, mid-30s, polite, distant, stepped out and approached Marcus with practiced neutrality. "Afternoon, sir. We received a call about a potential light pollution violation. I'm not here to enforce anything, just to check in." Marcus gestured to the setup, calm as ever. "All fixtures are within private property. Nothing aimed directly at the road or at anyone else's windows. Motion activated. Compliant wattage. Want to see the receipts?" The officer gave a short nod. "That won't be necessary. We're just here because someone made a complaint. Not a legal violation, more of a neighbor dispute." "Someone's wasting your time," Marcus said, standing slowly. "And mine." The officer offered a tight smile. "Probably, but we still have to knock. You know how it is." "I didn't," Marcus replied, "but I'm learning." They shook hands. The officer left. And Marcus realized the game had changed. It wasn't about lights anymore. It wasn't even about compliance. It was about pressure, about testing his limits, about breaking routine until he became the inconvenience they claimed him to be. That evening, he walked the fence line again, checking wiring and sensors. Everything in place. But when he reached the rear corner of the yard, where the ground dipped slightly and the fence turned at an angle, he found something new. An open bag of raw chicken wings scattered in the grass. Strange. No blood, no smell, just meat laid out in a pattern like bait. And beside it, half buried in the dirt, a torn grocery bag marked with a local store's logo. He stared at it for a long time. He didn't have pets. He didn't have enemies. Not until now. This was no accident. He collected the bag with gloves, sealed it in a trash bag, and stored it in the garage freezer. Not paranoia. Preparation. A few clicks online and he found a security company offering forensic-level residential footage review. He booked an appointment for the weekend. Meanwhile, he turned the floodlights inward as well as outward. If someone was trying to lure animals onto his property or provoke a confrontation, he would meet it head-on, with clarity and evidence. On the fourth night, around 3:22 a.m., one of the motion alerts pinged his phone. He opened the camera app, bleary-eyed, and watched the feed. A figure in a hooded sweatshirt moving along the side yard, just past the boundary line, staying low. No trespass, yet, but close enough. The lights activated immediately, flaring like magnesium. The figure froze for half a second, then retreated quickly into the darkness. Marcus saved the footage and emailed it to himself. A second later, a rock clattered against his back fence. Then silence. Then nothing. He didn't call the police. He knew what they would say. No damage, no trespass, no proof of intent. He wasn't looking for justice. He was building a case. Quietly, carefully, piece by piece. But the next day, the real blow came. A letter, this time mailed properly with a barcode and an official tracking number. It wasn't from the neighborhood office. It was from a law firm. Inside, a formal notice of legal intent. Marcus Ray was being cited for creating a public nuisance through excessive use of artificial lighting. The letter detailed alleged emotional distress caused to nearby residents, listed violations of multiple municipal code references, and concluded with a demand: disable all exterior floodlights within 72 hours or face civil action. At the bottom, a name he recognized. Nolan and Drake, attorneys at law. Karen's last name wasn't just for show, it was branding. He read the letter twice, then placed it beside the rest. He didn't pace. He didn't rant. He sat down, took a long breath, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. This wasn't about neighborhood rules anymore. It was war by attrition. And Marcus Ray had just begun to prepare. Marcus Ray never saw himself as a man drawn to conflict. He had always believed in staying in his lane, fixing what was his to fix, and keeping to himself unless someone gave him a reason to step forward. But there was a particular kind of insult in being painted as the aggressor by people who had spent weeks quietly escalating their campaign to make him bend. And now, with the letter from Nolan and Drake on his kitchen table, neatly typed and delivered like a bomb with a smile, Marcus knew there was no more room for patience. The legal notice was thin on evidence but thick with implied threat. Terms like malicious intent, emotional disruption, and persistent environmental hostility were peppered throughout as if written to frighten someone into compliance. Unfortunately for them, Marcus was long past the age of being intimidated by stationery. He spent that afternoon sitting at his desk, a yellow legal pad in front of him, making a list. Not a list of enemies, nor a list of grievances, but a list of all incidents since the first letter appeared. He wrote the dates, the events, who had spoken to him, what had changed, what had disappeared. He noted every irregular delivery, every strange sound at night, and every unexplained item left near his fence. He wasn't trying to build a lawsuit. He was building truth in order. His truth. One that no firm or committee could overwrite with bureaucracy and elegant threats. By the time the sun went down, he had 5 pages of documented events, a printed log of camera timestamps, and 3 bags of suspicious evidence stored in his freezer and garage. Still, none of it would matter without the right hands to carry it. The next morning, Marcus called the security company he'd researched, Fortified Vision, a private firm that mostly dealt with small business break-ins and home invasions. He wasn't looking for guards. He wanted a full audit of his surveillance system. The technician who showed up was a young man named Elias with soft hands and sharp eyes. Marcus respected him immediately for not asking any unnecessary questions. Elias reviewed the system quietly, then looked up from the monitor with a frown. "You're not being paranoid," he said. "Someone's jamming your motion sensors intermittently. Not constantly, just enough to prevent alerts on certain nights. I'm guessing they're using a localized RF burst. Cheap tech, but effective at short range." Marcus took this in without comment. "You want to upgrade to thermal overlay?" Elias asked. Marcus nodded once. 2 hours later, he had a new camera mounted with dual-band sensors and a discrete repeater installed near the roof. As Elias packed up his tools, he hesitated. "You sure this is about a light?" he asked. "No," Marcus said, "but it started with one." By evening, the atmosphere around his house had changed. The upgraded systems weren't visible from the road, but they radiated a quiet defiance, a message embedded in the new hardware. "I'm watching too." Marcus returned to his normal routine, or tried to, but he could feel the pushback coming like a storm surge. The silence was louder than confrontation. No letters, no knocks, no direct retaliation. Then the garbage stopped being collected. The first week he thought it might be a missed route. He waited an extra day, then called the sanitation department, who confirmed that his address had been marked as inactive per administrative request. Marcus filed a reinstatement immediately, but 2 days later, his recycling bins were overturned. Their contents spilled deliberately across the driveway. No wind, no raccoons, just placement. Intent. He cleaned it up without a word and installed a separate motion camera pointed solely at the curb. When it happened again the following week, this time with broken glass and something that smelled like spoiled meat tucked inside the lid, Marcus took the footage and drove directly to the district office. There, he met with a clerk who looked uncomfortable reading the incident form and offered him a generic apology that made Marcus want to scream. But he didn't. He asked firmly for the footage to be attached to his complaint and filed under his account. He wanted a paper trail. The next attack came not from the shadows, but from within his bank. His monthly mortgage payment bounced, an automatic payment that had never failed in years. He received a call from the bank notifying him of account authorization irregularities. When he visited in person, the clerk informed him that someone had attempted to reassign his mailing address and was flagged during security screening. Marcus asked for details, but the clerk shook her head apologetically. "We caught it early, Mr. Ray, but you may want to update your passwords." He did more than that. That evening, he closed every online account not essential to his life and moved his remaining savings into a high-security credit union 3 towns over. He bought a fireproof safe, printed every legal document he had, and backed up his entire surveillance network onto a secure external server. When he finished, he poured a glass of bourbon, sat on the porch, and waited. What he expected was a confrontation. What came was a drone. It was small, barely the size of a dinner plate, and it hovered just above the fence line, silent and steady, as if deciding whether to cross the boundary. Marcus stood up slowly, staring at it. The drone didn't move. Instead, a voice came from a speaker beneath its belly, tinny and robotic. "This is your final warning. De-escalate." Then it rose sharply and disappeared into the sky. Marcus stood motionless for several seconds, the bourbon glass still in his hand. Then he laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it had finally passed into something else. Raw, crystallized defiance. He called Kelsey Burdine the next morning, a lawyer he had worked with during the sale of one of his old properties years ago. She was younger, direct, and utterly ruthless in matters of property law. After a 30-minute conversation in which Marcus explained the entire escalation, she agreed to represent him. She didn't offer comfort. She offered strategy. We'll start by filing an injunction against any further fines or punitive actions under the neighborhood's regulatory code, she said. You're being targeted, but they're sloppy. These kinds of campaigns always overstep eventually. You just have to hold your ground. She filed paperwork that same day. By the following afternoon, the anonymous notices stopped. The sidewalk around his property was power washed. A new sanitation schedule was delivered with a note that read, "Corrected system error." The messages on his windshield ceased, but Marcus didn't let his guard down. He knew that silence wasn't surrender. It was a regrouping, and that night, just after midnight, the new thermal cameras picked up 3 heat signatures standing at the edge of his back fence. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood, watched, then turned and disappeared into the darkness just before the lights kicked on. And Marcus realized something deeper than he'd allowed himself to consider before. This wasn't about a neighborhood. This wasn't about compliance. It was a campaign. And now that he had resisted, they weren't just trying to push him out. They wanted to see what it would take to make him disappear. The week following the night figures appeared behind his fence, Marcus Ray began to understand that this wasn't about any one rule or light fixture. It had metastasized into something more insidious, a creeping effort to break him down, not by direct confrontation, but by isolation, inconvenience, and calculated escalation. There was a rhythm to it now, a pattern he could trace, not unlike the diagnostic procedures he'd relied on during his decades in automotive work. Every symptom pointed to a coordinated effort with no visible center. Someone, or several someones, were pulling strings, timing disruptions, applying pressure and retreating just enough to avoid legal accountability while keeping him off balance. And it was working, to a point. He couldn't rest. He couldn't fully relax even inside his own home. And yet, the more it wore on him, the more certain he became that he couldn't let it succeed. They were hoping he would snap, react, strike back irrationally so they could label him the problem, the aggressor, the man who brought chaos into their carefully curated neighborhood ecosystem. But Marcus didn't give them that. Not yet. Instead, he deepened his resolve and shifted his tactics. He made a quiet visit to the county zoning office, not because he expected them to intervene, but because he needed a copy of every local code that applied to residential lighting and privacy ordinances. He wanted the actual language, not the filtered version paraphrased by passive-aggressive memos and neighborhood mouthpieces. The woman at the front desk looked surprised when he asked, but obligingly printed the packet. Marcus spent the next 3 nights reading through it. It wasn't thrilling material, but it was thorough. He learned that his floodlight setup, though unconventional, fell within acceptable guidelines as long as the fixtures weren't mounted above a certain height and did not directly illuminate another dwelling's windows for more than 45 continuous seconds. He timed the sensors and adjusted beam angles accordingly. Now he had not just reason, but regulation on his side. Still, something gnawed at him. He had evidence, documentation, legal counsel, and a functioning surveillance network. But what he didn't have was clarity on motive. Who benefited from this? Who cared so much about a porch light or even 12 floodlights that they would commit this level of harassment? This coordinated series of actions that amounted to psychological warfare disguised as policy enforcement. And why him? Why now? That question loomed until the answer came from the most unexpected source, his mail carrier. Her name was Lori, mid-50s, polite but direct, and she had been dropping off his mail for the past 2 months without much conversation. But on a cool Thursday morning, as Marcus came out to retrieve a delivery, she pulled him aside with the kind of careful hesitation usually reserved for emergency room waiting rooms or whispered funeral comments. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, eyes scanning the street behind her. "But you should know you're not the first. The guy who lived 2 houses down before you, Mr. Jaffe, he left in a hurry last spring. No notice. Didn't even sell the place himself. Just vanished. Same deal. Lights, fines, then silence. One day the place was empty. No moving van. No boxes. Just gone. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. Why him? Laurie shrugged. Didn't fit, I guess. Kept to himself. Worked odd hours. People didn't like that. Said he didn't participate in events. A few of the board folks started checking in on him, like they were doing him a favor. Next thing you know, he's labeled as problematic. And then he's gone. What kind of events? Garden club, watch groups, that kind of thing. They like people who blend. You didn't hear it from me. She handed him his mail and moved on without another word. But Marcus stood at the curb long after the truck rolled away, the envelope in his hand suddenly feeling heavier. The implication wasn't just that he had been targeted. It was that there was a pattern, a history, and that the people behind it had learned how to make their actions look routine, clean, bureaucratic. That night, Marcus dug deeper. He looked into public property records for his street, tracked changes of ownership, and found 3 homes with remarkably short residencies over the past 2 years. One man died suddenly. No investigation. One woman relocated due to stress. One tenant stopped responding to mail, and the property reverted to the original management company, the same one Karen Nolan's husband co-owned until his quiet retirement last fall. That connection hadn't been visible before. But now, a thread began to emerge. He shared all of it with Kelsey, his lawyer, who agreed this was no longer just a property rights issue. It was potentially harassment under the guise of civic policy, maybe even conspiracy if it could be linked to gain or manipulation of property value. She contacted a private investigator, a retired analyst who specialized in local government corruption and homeowner intimidation cases. Marcus didn't know his name, didn't want to, but within days the man sent back a short dossier. Excerpts from internal emails and documents from a whistleblower tied to the same property management group. It included a disturbing line of text from Karen, addressed to the board president. If he won't cooperate, we push him until he becomes the story. Nobody backs a man who acts unstable. He'll hang himself with the right amount of rope. The words stuck to Marcus like tar. Now he understood. This wasn't personal in the emotional sense. It was personal in the methodical, targeted sense. He had simply been the next man to refuse assimilation, and for that he became a liability to be discredited and removed. With Kelsey's guidance, Marcus prepared a formal complaint package to be submitted to the county legal division, naming the management company, Karen Nolan, and several other board affiliates. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, but it was a step toward accountability. He wasn't expecting a miracle, but he knew now that visibility was power. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to do it in the light. As the package was being finalized, Marcus received a gift box on his porch. No return address, no card. Inside was a cracked, scorched floodlight casing, one of the earlier models he had removed and replaced. Burned, blackened, melted as if someone had run a blowtorch across the lens. And beneath it, a single word on a square of cardboard, handwritten in marker, "Enough." He stared at the box for several minutes before sealing it in a plastic bag. Then he picked up his phone and called Kelsey. "Tell your guy," he said calmly. "They just sent me a souvenir." She was silent for a moment. Then, "We go to the sheriff." First thing in the morning. That night, Marcus didn't walk the perimeter. He didn't check the wires. He didn't scan the camera feed or adjust settings. He poured himself a drink, turned on every light in the house and yard, and sat in the middle of it all, perfectly still, watching the shadows stay far, far away, because he knew now they weren't just trying to scare him. They were testing how far he'd go to protect what was his, and he was about to show them. The following morning, Marcus Ray drove in silence to the sheriff's substation just outside city limits, a plastic evidence bag sealed inside a manila envelope on the passenger seat. He'd already told Kelsey, who had arranged to meet him there, and her contact, the same retired investigator, was expected to join them as well. The station was small, plain, the kind of place built more for paperwork and neighborly disputes than serious investigation. But Marcus wasn't naive enough to expect a Hollywood response. He didn't want drama or promises. He wanted documentation. He wanted someone in uniform to look at what was happening and agree, in writing, that it wasn't normal, that he wasn't crazy, that something deeper and more dangerous was unfolding under the facade of local decorum. The sheriff's deputy on duty that morning, a man named Delgado, was attentive but cautious. He didn't dismiss Marcus. He didn't smirk or shrug. He listened, nodded, asked a few careful questions, and finally took the bagged floodlight casing with gloved hands. The plastic was scorched, warped in the center where heat had distorted the lens, and Delgado tilted it toward the overhead light thoughtfully. Someone torched this, not a malfunction. "You didn't find this on the lawn, you said?" "No," Marcus replied. "Boxed, delivered, left on the porch." "You touch anything else inside the box?" "Number?" "It went straight into that bag." "Any cameras catch the drop?" Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "Only shadows. Whoever did it timed it well." Delgado sighed and handed the bag off to a nearby clerk. "We'll log this as a potential harassment incident. Technically, there's no direct threat, nothing that says they're coming after you physically. But paired with what you're telling me about the history, the previous notices, the surveillance interference, that paints a different picture." He glanced at Kelsey. "Your counsel?" "I am. We're preparing a civil filing, but I advised my client to report this independently. There's enough here to justify concern for safety." Delgado nodded again. "Good call. We'll get a deputy to do a couple pass-throughs at night. Not stationed, but visible presence. I'll also flag your address in case any future calls come through. Should push your name to the top of the queue." It was more than Marcus expected. Not much, but enough to widen the playing field. The people harassing him, whoever they were, had thrived because everything had remained within shadows, behind curtains of procedure and anonymous notices. Now, the law had a foot in the door, however tentatively. It wouldn't stop the behavior, not yet, but it would shift the calculus. If they came again, they would come knowing he was no longer operating in silence. Back home, the air was different. Not because anything had changed visibly. His property still sat surrounded by its luminous defenses, the cameras hummed, and the house was spotless. But something beneath that veneer had shifted. He wasn't simply maintaining a perimeter anymore. He was fortifying under siege. Kelsey filed the harassment documentation the next day, and within 48 hours, a response came back. Not from the management company, not from the board, but from a third-party arbitration service claiming they had been appointed to mediate an ongoing dispute between a resident and the neighborhood governance body. The letter was insulting in its language, terms like shared accountability, community compromise, and voluntary reduction of conflict intensity. Phrases that neatly erased weeks of sustained psychological pressure and threats as though this were simply two neighbors arguing over a hedge. Marcus didn't reply. He sent the letter to Kelsey, who responded on official letterhead that her client was unwilling to participate in arbitration concerning a matter rooted in targeted intimidation, unauthorized property manipulation, and potential criminal coordination. She CC'd the county clerk. That night, the lights flickered. Only for a second, but enough to draw Marcus's attention. He checked the panels, the breakers, the sensors. All clean, all functional. But the power draw to the exterior system showed a brief interruption, a forced surge, something external. He logged the event, backed up the logs, and sent them to Elias from Fortified Vision. The next morning, Elias replied in a single-line email. "Someone's getting closer to your box." Marcus called the utility provider. No outages reported, no maintenance scheduled, no record of tampering, which only left one possibility: unauthorized access. Someone was trying to trip the system to weaken his defenses. But what they didn't know, what Marcus hadn't told anyone, not even Kelsey, was that the floodlight grid was on a backup relay system he designed himself after the first sensor blackout. Even if they managed to knock the power out entirely, the lights would stay active for 3 hours under battery reserve. That knowledge calmed him more than any sheriff patrol or legal form, because while they were still playing intimidation games, he was already preparing for siege. And the siege came 2 nights later. It started small, what sounded like a bottle breaking on the far edge of his back fence. Marcus checked the monitors, saw nothing, waited. Then came a rustling from the side yard. A second later, the lights flared, triggered by motion, and for a split second a figure was caught mid-stride. A man, average height, hoodie pulled low, running full speed toward the road. No confrontation, no noise. Just the sudden burst of movement and retreat. Marcus captured the footage and time-stamped it. But it wasn't over. 30 minutes later, another sound. This time a slow, scraping noise like plastic dragged across concrete. He looked at the feed. 3 garbage bins had been pulled from his driveway and flipped on their sides. No person visible. Then another light kicked on. Someone at the corner of the yard. They were trying to blind the cameras, working between motion pulses. He watched, fascinated and furious as they moved with practiced timing. Not kids, not vandals. These people had mapped his sensors, but they hadn't mapped him. Marcus stepped onto the porch with a high-powered flashlight, the kind hunters use in the dark. He didn't speak, didn't yell, just flicked the beam on and swept it across the lawn like a searchlight. The yard lit up like a stage. The bushes moved. Silence followed. By dawn, the damage was minimal. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, just the symbolic assertion that they could reach him, that his home, for all its lights and cameras and legal filings, was still vulnerable. But what they didn't understand was that Marcus had already factored vulnerability into his plans. He knew he couldn't build a fortress out of a suburban house. He didn't want to. What he wanted was exposure, documentation, and they had just delivered it. Kelsey arrived later that morning, reviewed the footage, and made her decision. We're filing for a protective order against the neighborhood committee, not individuals, the whole entity. It won't stop them, but it creates liability, and the moment they breach it, even by accident, we go straight to the DA. By week's end, Marcus had court dates. By the weekend, he had new locks, reinforced exterior panels, and a handheld thermal scanner he kept by the door. And then the most unexpected blow landed. The bank called. His mortgage, fully paid for the past 7 months, had been flagged for review. A clerical irregularity had been discovered in the property deed transfer, triggered by an anonymous audit request. His ownership was not in jeopardy, yet, but the freeze meant he couldn't refinance, couldn't move funds, couldn't make structural alterations until the issue was resolved. It was an old tactic. Bureaucratic pressure disguised as coincidence. But Marcus wasn't a first-time buyer. He had records, scans, contracts signed in duplicate and triplicate. Still, it slowed him down. And while the legal gears turned, he noticed other changes. Neighbors avoiding his eyes, cars slowing outside his house, lawn care companies suddenly canceling service with vague apologies about schedule conflicts. Then came the warning call. Blocked number. A deep voice, distorted electronically. Back off, Mr. Ray. You think you're building a case, but you're building a wall around yourself. One day you'll look up and realize no one's on your side. Then the line went dead. Marcus didn't call back. He didn't trace the number. He just sat for a long time, the phone heavy in his palm, thinking about what it meant to be truly alone. But he wasn't. Because later that week, a small envelope arrived at his door, unsigned. Inside were photographs, black and white, time-stamped, showing a man in a black hoodie placing the burned floodlight casing on Marcus's porch. A sticky note attached read simply, "You're not the only one watching." And with that, Marcus understood two things. First, that the people coming for him weren't just a couple of disgruntled neighbors. They were connected, structured, protected by layers of civility and process. Second, that somewhere in this perfectly manicured hellscape, someone else was just as sick of pretending as he was. Someone who had decided enough was enough. And Marcus, for the first time in months, allowed himself a smile. Because it meant he wasn't fighting a war alone anymore. He had just become the face of someone else's silent resistance. The envelope with the photographs changed everything. For weeks, Marcus Ray had been fighting a battle of attrition, each move calculated for endurance, not retaliation. But those images, grainy yet clear enough to identify posture, movement, and location, signaled a turning point. He wasn't imagining things, he wasn't paranoid, and more importantly, someone else had been watching, quietly collecting evidence without asking for thanks, permission, or attention. Whether it was out of shared frustration or deeper strategy remained unclear, but the message was undeniable. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Somewhere out there, someone else had reached their limit. And with that realization, Marcus felt a surge of grim determination rise in him. The time for endurance was ending. The time for exposure had come. He forwarded the envelope and its contents to Kelsey the same day. Within hours, she had the files cataloged, time-stamped, and added to the existing court materials under protective seal. The legal mechanism was slow, but it was grinding forward now with unmistakable momentum. The protective order against the Neighborhood Management Committee was signed and stamped, backed by Marcus's documented timeline of harassment, witness reports from the sheriff's office, and now, third-party photographic evidence. It was enough to trigger a formal review hearing in county court, scheduled within 10 business days. Until then, the committee had been legally restrained from further fines, surveillance, or contact with Marcus in any form, direct or indirect. But of course, that didn't mean they would stop. The very next morning, a work crew arrived in front of Marcus's house without notice. 4 men in neon vests hauling orange cones and drilling equipment. When he stepped outside to ask what they were doing, one of them answered flatly that they had been contracted to perform emergency maintenance on the water line running under his property. Marcus didn't shout. He simply asked to see the work order. The man hesitated, glanced at a clipboard, and mumbled that the supervisor wasn't on site yet. Marcus told them to wait at the curb until he called the city utility office. Within 15 minutes, the crew was packing up, muttering among themselves, after a representative on the phone confirmed no such maintenance had been authorized or scheduled. It was an illegal excavation attempt, quiet, deliberate, and timed before the court hearing. Marcus logged the encounter, sent it to Kelsey, and filed a supplemental complaint. What unnerved him most wasn't the incident itself. It was the ease with which they attempted it. As if there were no fear of consequence, as if every action was covered by invisible assurances of impunity. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was trespass with intent to damage, and that meant escalation was inevitable. On the evening before the court date, just past midnight, Marcus heard the sound again. Feet crunching on gravel, too deliberate for animals. The motion lights activated a split second later, flooding the yard. But instead of retreating, 2 figures stood still in the glare, just outside the property line. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood, hands in pockets, heads tilted slightly as if assessing the house. Marcus watched from the upstairs window, phone in hand, recording. After nearly 45 seconds, the lights dimmed. The men vanished into the darkness. No vehicles, no rush, just disappearance like smoke in the wind. The next morning, Kelsey met him outside the county courthouse. She carried a thick folder under her arm and wore the expression of someone who had stopped expecting logic from people long ago. The hearing wasn't public, but it was formal, conducted in a secure courtroom with a judge known for ruling conservatively. Marcus sat beside her, silent, while the opposing side's counsel, a smug man in his 50s representing the management committee, attempted to paint the entire ordeal as a mutual communication breakdown. They used terms like unfortunate, escalation, community cohesion challenges, and light fixture misunderstandings. Kelsey didn't flinch. She presented the photographs, the police reports, the court orders, the timeline, the surveillance logs, and then quietly laid the burned floodlight casing on the table in its sealed bag. The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward. "Is this a functional fixture?" "No, Your Honor," Kelsey answered. "It was hand-delivered to my client's porch following multiple threats and system disruptions. It's evidence of coordinated intimidation, not a communication error." The committee's lawyer objected. Lack of forensic verification, speculative motives, but the judge waved him off. "This isn't about criminal proof, it's about pattern. And what I see is targeted behavior cloaked in procedural language." He looked at Marcus. "You've kept detailed records." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge exhaled slowly. "Then I'm extending the protective order into a permanent injunction, effective immediately. Any further actions taken against Mr. Ray, direct or indirect, will be considered retaliatory under state harassment law. I'm also recommending this case be forwarded to the district attorney for review. Civil liability may be the least of your client's concerns." The opposing lawyer's face twisted, but he didn't argue. The room had shifted. The weight had shifted. The facade was cracking. Marcus left the building with Kelsey in silence, the noise of the city around them muffled by adrenaline and clarity. Something had cracked open in that room, not just in the case, but in the very structure these people had hidden behind. They weren't invincible. They weren't untouchable. And they had just lost their strongest weapon, the illusion that no one would challenge them with enough documentation, enough consistency, and enough sheer will. But the war wasn't over. 2 nights after the hearing, Marcus came home to find his garage door open. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. Just open. His heart pounded in his throat as he cleared the house methodically, room by room. No signs of forced entry. No obvious tampering. Only a printed flyer tacked to the inside of the door, flapping gently in the breeze. It read, "Lights don't make you safe. Neither do courts." There was no logo, no signature. Just those words, printed in all caps, and a thin smear of grease along the bottom edge, like it had been handled by someone wearing mechanic's gloves. He took it down, placed it into a bag, and sat in the living room for nearly an hour without turning on the lights. The message wasn't about fear. It was about provocation. They wanted him to lash out now, to respond outside the law. But they had underestimated something. Marcus Ray didn't need to be angry to fight. He needed only a reason. And now he had dozens. Every letter, every fine, every silent night where he watched figures study his home like scavengers. They had made him a target. Now he was becoming a symbol. His case had been cited in 2 other filings already, one in a nearby district, another in a neighboring county. Both from homeowners experiencing similar campaigns of compliance enforcement that quickly evolved into property intimidation, and both mentioned his name. The next morning he stood in front of his porch with a coffee in one hand and a folded copy of the injunction in the other. A neighbor he didn't know, a man in his 60s, bald, wearing a windbreaker, walked by and gave him a nod. "Keep it lit," the man said without stopping. Marcus smiled faintly. "I plan to." And then he turned back toward the house, toward the quiet hum of the lights overhead, knowing that for the first time in months the game had changed. They might come again. They might try to scare him, disrupt him, isolate him. But now there were eyes on them too. Now there were cracks in the system. Now, every move they made became another thread in a tapestry of exposure. And Marcus Ray was no longer a man under pressure, he was the one applying it. The weeks following the hearing settled into a strange calm, not the silence of surrender, but the hush that comes when a storm passes without quite finishing its destruction. The injunction held firm. No further letters arrived. No shadows lingered beyond the fence. And yet Marcus Ray knew better than to mistake quiet for resolution. He'd learned that some enemies didn't retreat. They simply adjusted their angles, waited for opportunities, watched for weaknesses. But this time, there was nothing left to take from him. His home was fortified, not with cameras or floodlights or paperwork, but with something far more unshakable: visibility. They couldn't erase him anymore. His name had weight, carried now in conversations behind closed doors, in neighborhood meetings where his presence, his defiance, had become a cautionary tale. And whether they liked it or not, Marcus had proven something none of them had expected. He could outlast them. Kelsey continued filing civil motions, each one calculated not to punish, but to preserve. There was no media campaign, no spectacle. Marcus didn't want that, and she respected it. But word still spread. 3 houses on the other side of the subdivision posted official notices of board withdrawal, residents choosing to opt out of committee oversight under clause exemptions that had long been buried in the governing documents but were now being dusted off and circulated. A quiet rebellion, not led by banners but by paperwork. One couple left entirely, selling their house well below value just to avoid the mess. Another neighbor, Lori, the mail carrier, retired early, leaving behind only a note in Marcus's mailbox that said, "It was worth it to see someone finally stand up." The house itself remained unchanged. The lights stayed. The cameras stayed. Marcus no longer watched the feeds compulsively, but he never stopped checking them either. It had become part of his routine, not out of fear, but out of principle. You don't let your guard down just because the noise stops. You pay attention to the silence, too. The burned floodlight casing remained in his safe. The flyer from the garage door, now laminated, sat beneath a stack of court documents in a locked drawer. Not trophies, not warnings. Reminders. He had seen what lengths people would go to when they wanted control without confrontation. He had watched how rules became weapons, how committees became coalitions of silence, how pressure could be dressed in politeness and weaponized under the mask of order. And most of all, he had learned what it meant to push back not with rage or recklessness, but with resolve. Spring came, and with it an invitation. Not from the board, they no longer sent anything, but from a small group of neighbors Marcus had never met officially. They asked if he'd attend an informal meeting. No politics, no agenda, just residents who wanted to understand what had really happened. Marcus considered declining. He had never wanted to be anyone's leader or example, but something about the tone of the note, respectful, uncertain, made him pause. He went. They met in a backyard, seated on folding chairs under string lights. There were 9 of them. Young, old, retired, working. They asked questions gently. What had started it, how far it went, how he had stayed so focused. Marcus answered honestly, sparing them the worst details but giving them the truth. He spoke about watching people try to reduce him to a disruption, about how they used procedures not to protect property, but to control behavior. And how, through it all, the hardest part hadn't been the surveillance or the threats. It had been the isolation. When he finished, one of the older men leaned forward and said, "You gave the rest of us permission to stop pretending." After that, they met regularly. Not always about the neighborhood, sometimes just to talk. And slowly, Marcus saw the shift. Not in power, not in structure, but in people. Neighbors began speaking more freely, asking real questions, pushing back on board decisions. No one challenged the injunction. No one touched his lights again. But one morning, While trimming the hedge along his front fence, Marcus noticed something new. A set of solar spotlights newly installed across the street, mounted with precision. Then another house with a camera that hadn't been there before. Quiet acknowledgments, not mimicry, solidarity. The board never issued another fine. Karen Nolan disappeared from public meetings altogether. Her name remained on the website, but no one saw her. Eventually, a rumor floated by that she had stepped down. Marcus didn't follow up. He didn't care. The board could rot from within for all he cared. He wasn't after revenge. He had something more valuable now. His home, his dignity, and his place in a neighborhood that had once tried to erase him. On a cool evening in early summer, Marcus sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the street. A soft breeze moved through the hedges. The lights clicked on as a car passed. And then, across the street, the new neighbor waved, not out of obligation, but out of something real. Marcus waved back. He wasn't the kind of man to call it victory. He didn't need to. But in the stillness of that evening, surrounded by light and the absence of fear, he allowed himself a rare thought. Sometimes, holding your ground is more than enough. Sometimes, survival is the loudest statement you can make. And sometimes, when no one else speaks, one man's refusal to go dark is the beginning of everything.